Sorry, was somebody saying something to me?
I was. This is Virginia Valiant.
Hi, Virginia.
Hi. On the screen, your name is in red and Julie's is in blue. And with the recent significance that red and blue have, I was wondering how you felt about being red.
Sorry.
I welcome the opportunity to read.
Dear colleagues and friends, I think that most of you are already familiar with the format of our linguistic contest organized by the Linguistic Aperitif Group. Tonight, we discuss one further major topic in syntactic research, almost a classic, namely case. As usual, we have invited two prominent researchers on this problem. Tonight, we have Julie Legate from UPenn and Mark Baker from Rutgers University. And tonight's moderator is Joseph Bayer from the University of Constance. As usual, the two opponents will exchange ideas and give us their view by answering 3 questions offered by the moderator and have 5 minutes each to give us their answers to each question. At the end, the moderator will summarize and comment the results, and then we open the discussion, which will include from Zoom's questions from Zoom and from YouTube. For security reasons, the chat, microphone, and screen sharing functions have been disabled during the debate, but the chat will be active at the end for you to write in if you intend to ask a question, and we will enable your microphone. Those of you who won't be able to ask their questions can send it to me via email to the following address, ceciliapoletto@gmail.com. I will collect the questions and send them to the speakers for a later reply. The event is being streamed on YouTube, so if you ask a question, you are giving your consent to be streamed and recorded. Please feel free to distribute the link of the YouTube registration you have received with the flyer to students, colleagues, and post it on your social media. And now I leave the floor to Joseph Bayer for tonight's contest.
Yes, good evening. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I'm Joseph Bayer, and I'm moderating this event tonight on case. In order to prepare a little for this event, an anecdote came to my mind. It was in 2002 or so when I worked with some colleagues on the processing of case in German. It was an ERP experiment, and our paper went into a high-level cognitive science journal. And then we got the reviews, and one of the comments of the editor-in-chief was, "Can you please explain in 2 lines to our audience what is case?" So I was rather puzzled about this, because lots of language studies appear in this journal. And so I said to myself, this must be an audience in which there was no background in Latin in school somehow. Now, but then I looked in aspects of the theory of syntax, and lo and behold, I found only one entry for case. So, and this was about the alternation between him and he, between D structure and surface structure. So it seems to me that until this famous letter by Jean-Roger Vergniaud, the question of case in generative grammar was somehow not very much different from what everybody knew from school grammar. So case was basically was just a device, you know, to assign some morphological or not a morphological form to an NP, and there was not much of a topic until later on. There was this famous article by Fillmore, The Case of Case. But this was largely a semantic motivation for case. And so the real event in the development of case started with this important letter by Vergniaud and the detection that there's abstract case next to morphological case. And so we can see that the time is not too big until we really had something like a syntactic considerations of case. Nowadays, of course, we have reached a point where basically the standard theory is now the minimalist theory of case assignment in relation to functional categories, functional heads. But and we will see now that the opinions of this about this have quite a wide coverage. So there are now entirely non-conformist views of case, and the more languages are coming into the game, the more varied this picture is. So the whole debate on ergative absolute was not there before in the earlier days of generative grammar, but all of this is now around. And so the questions that we have now, they could not have been asked in these years before. So today we have, as Cecilia said already, two experts here, Julie Legate from the University of Pennsylvania and Mark Baker from Rutgers University. Both of them have written books not far long ago. Julie has written a book, Voice and Little V, Lessons from Achenese. And Mark Baker has, in 2015, a book, Case, Its Principles and Parameters. So I don't think I need to say more about them. And we can start here with, there are three questions which you have presumably received on this invitation to the flash mob. I will read out the question, the first question, and then give the first question. Is, are direct cases a byproduct of agree, or do they derive from the algorithm of dependent case? And so I give the word to Julie, and you will have 5 minutes, and then we go over with the same question to Mark. Okay, is everything clear so far? You can see a handout or a PowerPoint. Okay, then it's good. You have, Julie, you have to activate your mic.
Yes. So you can all see the slides?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Thank you. So I want to begin today with a broader perspective to situate my contribution here. And so this is a perspective on syntax in general, whereby universal grammar is quite limited, radically underspecified, perhaps only consisting of the binary branching structure creating operation merge. Now, I've been convinced of this position through an increased understanding of the extent of language variation, also through Noam's evolutionary argument, which he sometimes calls Darwin's problem, also from advances in language learning. And so you had the last flash mob on this topic. So from this perspective, case then is learned on the basis of experience. It's not innate. And as we expect from this perspective, typologically, we find that case varies dramatically across languages. And Josef mentioned that in his introduction. And so what this means is that case can be learned based on any of the relationships that are provided by merge. And so agree then is a relationship between a head and a noun phrase. Dependent case is a relationship between two noun phrases. Both of these relationships are available to the child. And so both could, in principle, be used for case assignment. And so in that sense, I believe Mark and I actually agree on the at least theoretical availability of both options. This is intended to be a debate. So let me bring out what I believe are two differences between Mark and my positions. So one is that while dependent is in principle available, I have yet to be convinced of the need of it in practice. So, you know, I have just finally gotten a Sacha consultant, so ask me what I think about that language in a couple of months. But so what we find is that even dependent case definitely needs head DP relationships, and this is well understood. Not that slide. There we go. So we have lexical or inherent case. We have adpositional cases. We have cases assigned by complementizers. And so these are cases that are based on a head noun phrase relationship. Now, so in that sense, I think it's very clear that we need that kind of case assigned in that kind of relationship. In addition, my students and I at Penn have been focusing more on voice-related phenomenon in recent years, and we've ended up discovering a number of constructions in which what looks like a standard accusative on a grammatical object has to be assigned in absence of a higher case competitor. And so I've listed some constructions here for you. These are just the languages we happen to have looked at. So I have no doubt that there are many more out there. I'm not going to have time to go through all these. I, of course, am happy to talk about them in the questions. I'm going to highlight one because I think that's how much time I have. So this is what has been called active existentials in Lithuanian. This is work by Milena Šeikoitė. It's to appear in LI. And so what we see is that the object is receiving accusative case. She argues it's indeed a grammatical object. It's the normal accusative case, changes to genitive in negation. And so when she brought this construction to me, she had already developed a number of tests in the language to figure out if an argument is syntactically projected or not. So we thought, fun, let's sit down, find this agent. We threw every test possible at it. This agent is not syntactically projected. So in the upcoming LI paper, she has 10 arguments to this effect, from binding, agreement, scope, depictives, anything. I think I've given you, yeah, so I've given you an example from binding here. Instead of the dean's office, we try to make it the agent's office. There's a reflexive of a pronoun. There's nothing that will do that. That thing is not syntactically projected. Now, of course, these, like I said, there's a number of constructions that show these this kind of property. And so I think these are showing us that even for accusative case on a grammatical object, we definitely need a X0 assigned case or a agree assigned case. Okay. I'll say, can I say one more thing?
Yes.
Just one more way in which I think we differ, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong. It's that for case to be analyzed as agree-based, I believe Mark would like there to be a full correlation between that case and morphological agreement. Whereas to my mind, the structural head noun phrase relationship is available and so can be used without issue independently of morphological agreement or along with it. So I'll stop there.
Okay, he will have now the chance to say something concretely about this. Okay, Mark, you are on. You have to activate your microphone.
Yes.
Oh, great.
Good. And I have to activate my slides. So let's see about that. Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
You will, let's do it in this order. Share screen. There's that. And how am I doing?
Great.
Okay. Yep. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you about this. So I've set this up this way. I have an initial slide here just to make sure we're talking about the same thing when we talk about dependent case and case by agree. So dependent case schemas, I say if you have rules like if one noun phrase C commands another noun phrase in a certain domain, assign some case to that, call it ergative. That's high dependent case. If some NP is C commanded by another NP in a domain, assign some other case to it, low dependent case, we could call that one accusative. And always there's also the possibility of unmarked default cases too. Otherwise, if you're in that domain, then you get maybe some additional case. So those are the dependent case kind of rules. And these are that's compared to a rule like this. If a functional head F enters into agree with some noun phrase, assign its case to that noun phrase. So that's what I have in mind about what these rules would look like. And then the way that my work on this evolved was my encounter with the Saha language, also the Amharic language, and the Shipibo language have convinced me, although not Julie, that there does need to be dependent case in the world. So then I look at, from that perspective, what kind of typology would you get of cases? And then we can ask for which ones of these, as there's remaining uncertainty in my mind anyway, about whether they're coming by the dependent case kind of rules or whether they're coming from the structural kinds of rules. So I assume that there's three kinds of phases that are relevant. So three kinds of domains, a domain of TP, the domain of VP, and the domain of DP. There could be others, but these are the main ones. Case to a C commanding noun phrase in a TP domain is ergative, to a low noun phrase in that domain accusative, otherwise nominative or absolutive. When inside the lower VP domain, here that's how I would analyze structural dative, like the kinds you get in causative constructions in many cases, but also ditransitive constructions. To the lower of two objects inside a verb phrase, Chamorro has a special oblique case. Maybe an unmarked case in these kind of domains is something like the partitive in Finnish. And then inside nominal domains, you can have different kinds of genitive with slightly different distributions. So this is the kind of perspective that you would expect on the world from a dependent case theory, the kind of typology that naturally emerges from dependent case theory as I know it and love it anyway. And then we look through these and ask, can they be done by agreement or not? To my mind, that's particularly difficult for ergative in a way that I'll sketch out in the second question. I'll with that. And similar issues come up with dative. So by far, I've sort of proved to my satisfaction that under what I mean by agreement anyway, these cannot well be done by agreement in a way that we go back to. Then these are sort of rarer kinds of cases, only in a couple of languages that I don't know very well, so I don't really want to push that. But then we have these other kind of cases where, to my mind, there is still a real question whether this can be done by accusative, whether this can be done by dependent case or by agreement. That's genitive, so it could be the unmarked case in a DP, but it could also be case assigned under agreement with D. This could be accusative case. It could be done by dependent case, but it could be done by agreement with little v or voice. This could be default case, but it could be done with T. And these, I don't know. In the specific cases of Saha and Amharic, I think the dependent case works better. And to me, it's not so much that you have to see the agreement, but if you do see the agreement, it better line up. And what's interesting to me about Amharic is you do have agreement with objects and you do have accusative case marking, but they don't line up. There are mismatches in both directions. So that's the real problem there for me. Then the issue about nominative and absolutive, my last slide on this is just to pose why I'm not sure about that. On the one hand, you can have a rule like if F enters into agree with a noun phrase, assign case to it. But Jonathan Boblik has argued, and I agree with him, that you can also have rules like if a head enters into agree with X, only if X has a particular case. So this is T assigns nominative under agreement, but this is T agrees with a noun phrase only if it's nominative. I call the first kind assigning case by agree. The second kind is case sensitive to agree. And in my work on this, there's a subtle difference between these two, and maybe too subtle. That to me is the question here. So both kinds of rules, you'd have T agrees with nominative subjects and T does not agree with oblique subjects. The difference comes down to what Vergniaud was interested in here. What happens if there is no finite T? And there's a subtle difference between Tamil, where if there's no finite T, you can still have a nominative subject, versus Saha, where in participle relatives, there's no finite T and you cannot have a nominative subject. Either the subject has to be null or not. So to me, is there still place for case assigned by agree? Yes, here in Saha for nominative and accusative, and maybe in some of the cool constructions that Julie's got out there that I'm going to have to read about. I'm open to that. I'm a pretty eclectic kind of guy too. I believe in more universal grammar than Julie does still, I guess, but I'm not very narrow about it. But, you know, I talk to people like Jonathan Boblik, and he says, well, is the inability to have an overt subject here in Saha, is that enough to keep agree assigned, case assigned by agree in our theory or not? And I'm not fully settled on that in my mind. So that's what I have to say on that issue. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We are well going in time. May I add that in Bengali, which is an Indo-European language, you have the same thing as in Tamil. You have non-finite clauses, for instance, conditional clauses, and they have an overt subject. So I
think there are a lot of languages like that. And I worked on Saha for a year before I saw the virtues that the case theory might have in that language.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is question B now. And the first to answer question B is Mark again. So the question B is, how do you account for ergative versus accusative alignment? Did you hear it?
Yep. And here I'm trying to share again. And I thought when we were organizing this, it seemed very reasonable that Julie and I would trade off who went first and went second, but then I didn't realize I'd have to go twice in a row. So there you go. That's a problem. Yes. So ergative versus accusative alignment. Sorry, let me turn back on my timer too. All right, I won't turn back on my timer, but therefore I don't know. Yeah, so, you know, I gave you these rules, and then the view would be that languages can pick from this library of rules made possible by universal grammar or maybe general conceptual primitives of the language, Julia would say, I guess. So if you pick rule A, you'll have ergative case on the subjects of transitive verbs only. If you pick rule B, you'll have accusative case on the objects of transitive verbs only. If you pick rule C, you'll have that, and you can mix and match. You can pick ergative in your language. You can pick accusative in your language. You can pick both, and then you're a tripartite language. Going beyond that usual thing. And I think Julie has shown that there are more of these in the world than we thought. Or you can pick neither, and then you're a neutral language. And then the agreement may follow the case if it's that kind where a head agrees with something only if it has a particular case, in which case this kind of case typology will also influence the agreement you see in the language. But the agreement can be more or less independent as well, depending on that. Now, on this issue about ergative, here's my where I fill in this bit about why I think ergative is particularly hard to do by agreement. The versions of doing it by agreement that I know of are roughly like this. Maybe Julie will have another one, but you say a special thing about little v's that have agents. That's the head that maybe can assign ergative case to a DP under agreement. But to me, conceptually, this really should give you an active agreement pattern, not a true ergative agreement pattern. A true ergative agreement pattern is where you have ergative case on almost only transitive subjects and almost all transitive subjects, with little caveats to come. Whereas an active case pattern would be one that would treat external arguments like the subject of work differently from the internal arguments like unaccusative verbs like this. And the languages that I've worked on, Shipibo, for example, but Typology bears this out too, active patterns are really rare in dependent case languages, maybe non-existent. Whereas the languages which treat these, despite their different theta roles, the same, are much more common. And what's particularly striking about this in Saha, which I find convincing, is that both for unaccusative verbs and unergative verbs, you can add a second noun phrase, an applied object, expressing who's there. And then in this case, the subject gets accusative, whether, or, I'm sorry, gets absolutive, whether or not it's an agent, and here it gets ergative whether or not it's an agent. So to me, this is a very convincing paradigm saying that ergative depends on the number of arguments that are in the clause, not their theta roles. So it doesn't depend on the presence of a head like this, but the dependent case algorithm. And I think under certain assumptions, you can almost prove that agreement won't work for a language like that. Depends on your assumptions, of course, but if transitive subjects are in the same position as intransitive ones, as in most languages, and little v's aren't naturally individuated by what happens inside the verb phrase, whether there's a DP there somewhere else in the structure or not, you can almost prove that this can't be done by agreement. Now here's a but. There are complications in these languages. Even in my pure ergative language like Shipibo, there are 6 known predicates which have a double absolutive construction. And I don't think there's any particular problem of explaining that within a differential, within a dependent case framework, because you can show that the clauses have different syntactic structures. These are 2 internal arguments where transitives have one internal and one external. Here, the higher argument has become the subject, whereas in the other case, the lower argument has. So there's plenty of space for dependent case theory to operate here, I think, using things like the idea of domains. And this gets me into some complicated interactions between case theory and movement. But I admit that these constructions do blur the distinction between the theories a little bit, because here you might say, well, that doesn't get ergative because this doesn't have an agentive little v in it. So this kind does blur the distinction a little bit, but I'm more swayed by the other kind, which is convincing to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, okay, then the same question B now goes to Julie. You again have 5 minutes to work on this. You have to activate your microphone.
All right, I think I'm set here.
Yes.
Okay, so as you might expect from on the perspective that I've been taking from impoverished universal grammar. This means that ergative patterns are learned in the input. So there's no singular phenomenon of ergative alignment, and so no expectation of uniform analysis. And I think indeed that's what empirical work has shown. There's really a wide range of languages and language types and constructions that get put under the ergative bracket. Now, there are a few leading analyses of ergative. So two of them I would say are based on a head nominal relationship. So Mark mentioned the one that's assigned on a spec head configuration by the theta assigner, if you want to call that little v or voice. There's another approach that's become popular these days. So Amy Rose Deal, Emily Clem, and also Farouka Koush, that claims that it's the combination of two heads. So one of these being the theta assigner and another one being a higher head in an agree type relationship. And of course, there's the dependent case approach that Mark was just talking about. I want to say a little bit of an aside on the inherent versus structural debate. So this is typically framed in those contexts. I think these days that's a bit of a mistake, in that, of course, the inherent versus structural distinction are not uniform categories. So semantic interpretation and syntactic structure are both available to the child, and so both can be learned in using a case distribution. And indeed, when we look at inherent case, what we find is that this can exhibit a range of behaviors. And so we've come up with names for them, right? So quirky case, inert case, you have lexical versus inherent. So I think we need to be careful a little bit the way we frame these. So going back to these kind of analyses, all of these relationships are provided by merge, and so all are available in principle to the child. Where Mark and I differ, I think he is convinced that dependent case is right for most ergative languages. I've yet to be convinced of the need for it, so you can ask me in the questions what I think about Shipibo if you want. What I think we find cross-linguistically is that assignment of ergative case is found most stably with canonical transitive events. And so I'm thinking back to old work by Hopper and Thompson here. So realis, volitional agent, punctual event, affected patient. And so cross-linguistically, any decrease in transitivity can result in the loss of ergative. And it's extremely typical for multiple factors to be relevant in a single language. So I've listed non-exhaustively a few here. So non-agentive thematic subjects, imperfective aspect, unaffected theme, pseudo-incorporated theme, if the theme doesn't agree, if it's oblique case marked, if it's higher in the nominal hierarchy than the agent is, if there's a CP complement rather than nominal, if there isn't a complement. Right, so for example, I'm just going to give a couple here. So ergative is retained with dative unaffective objects in Walbury, but not in Japu. Ergative is retained with a CP complement in Shangla, but not in Shipibo. Ergative is lost with an object ranking higher than the subject in Yukulta, but not in Walbury, Hindi, etc. And so what I think is that the dependent case analysis really hones in on one aspect of the loss of transitivity. So this lowered DP to be a case competitor, and sort of tries to shoehorn this variation into this single dimension. And so you end up dealing with variation through what counts as a competitor. So different things have to count in different languages. You end up positing concealed transitives sometimes. I had to mention this example. So Basque on accusatives. So this is a case where it's been proposed as a concealed transitive with an approximately meaningless and phonologically null, but nevertheless counting DP. And so I think part of the reason that the dependent case analysis ends up being pushed into these kind of analyses is that lexical exceptions are very frequent in ergative systems, but really sit uneasily within this kind of analysis because it's a relationship between two nominals. And so why would the identity of the lexical predicate matter? And so positing a null DP is sort of a way to go about this. I want to finish by saying that, you know, I used to work more on ergativity, and I've worked more on voice these days. And I have to say that the transition from looking at ergativity to looking at passive is really interesting in that you get very similar considerations when you can passivize cross-linguistically and when you get ergative case cross-linguistically. It's about this core transitivity, but the way these phenomena are treated in the literature is very different. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but you have to continue right now. Our choreography shows that. So you come in a row. And I'm afraid that number C is not even a question. It just says morphological case versus syntactic case. I didn't know that morphological case is not syntactic, but anyway, that seems to be the idea. Yes, you have to activate your microphone.
Right. I shouldn't have stopped sharing and turned off my camera. I indeed forgot again that I had to go right away. All right. So I think this is the place where I think Mark and I disagree the least. So I want to start by leaving aside the distribution of nominals. So the notion of abstract case with a capital C. Again, the case filter isn't innate, and so whether this is really about the distribution of nominals and whether it ends up being posited in any particular language is sort of a independent question. There's no universal case filter. So then morphological versus syntactic case, yes, this isn't a question, but we can be talking about case in different levels. So there's a syntactic question. So you've got case assigned in the syntax. Then you've got this sort of abstract morphological level, which is what is the case morphology trying to realize, right? And so this could be directly what was assigned in the syntax, or it may have been modified through morphological operations. And then, of course, there's the particular morphophonological realization of any particular case inserted via the elsewhere condition. So there's a relationship between the syntactic and the morphological case, but this can be imperfect. So then you get interesting questions. So this means that when you see a case morpheme in a language sometimes, but not others, then you have to look to see if this is what way back in Nell's 2005, I called this differential syntax. So the type of that type of DP is just never assigned to that case, or differential morphology, where the case is assigned but can't be realized morphologically. And so you need tests to be able to distinguish between these. So is the morphological realization of that case for that particular lexical item found elsewhere in the language? If it's found elsewhere but not in a particular environment, then maybe it's because it's not assigned in that environment. If it's not found anywhere, then maybe it's just that it couldn't be morphologically realized in the language. Is there case agreement in the language? And if so, do these trigger marked case agreement? And so, oops. So, you know, for example, we have, here's an Australian language. The child is marked ergative, woman is marked absolutive, ergative absolutive pattern, but the pronouns serving as initial elements in the noun phrase are showing nominative accusative. So we're seeing a tripartite case assignment through the case agreement. Oh, here's a case from Marathi where you see that, so oops, nominatives, sorry, first and second person pronouns don't show ergative morphology In the perfective, this is because they can't show that morphology. Ergative is triggered through case agreement. In the imperfective, we find it's just not assigned through case agreement. We can also check if there's syntactic case sensitivity in the language. Syntactic ergativity, or only certain elements can become grammatical subjects, and if so, do the unmarked DPs behave like marked DPs or not? Coordination can also distinguish between these. So implicit in this discussion has been that, contra some proponents of dependent case, although I don't believe Mark, case is indeed based on syntactic relationships, not just based on a morphological structure. So two reasons that I believe this. So one is that case can be based on a non-surface position. So it has to be based on an intermediate stage during the syntax, not what is fed into the morphology. Also, we have syntactic operations that are sensitive to case. So Omer Preminger has shown this in his work. I'm going to mention here Girbal. So in Girbal, case assignment shows that there is underlying, case agreement shows there is underlying ergative assigned to nominative, accusative pronouns. And indeed, Girbal is a language that's famous for syntactic ergativity, and the first and second person pronouns behave as though they were ergative for syntactic ergativity. So what we're seeing is sensitivity to this abstract, in the syntax, to an abstract level of case assignment, not to any particular morphology. Finally, so what do you do when you don't see any case in the language at all? Well, if there's nothing in the input that forces the child to posit case, then the language does not have case. Similarly, there is no universal set of cases. So if you've got no evidence for ergative or dative or whatever in the language, then that case is just not there. And so we end up with really interesting questions about what is needed in the input to lead a child to posit case. So agreement is sometimes used. If there's no case at all in the language, we really need to think about whether the child could just be learning the agreement pattern as an agreement pattern instead of through the intermediary of always zero case marking. Constraints on movement. So there was an interesting talk by Emily Drummond at LSA this year arguing for syntactic ergativity in a language without ergative case marking. And so that's, we need to think about, could this be learned as a restriction on syntactic movement rather through the intermediary of case? But these are the considerations that we need to think of in a language that has no case morphology. Thanks. You're muted.
Mark, yes, activate your microphone. Your microphone, yes.
Yep, I was just distracted by trying to screen share, and I don't know how to do the two at the same time. So, all right, but now I'm not muted, but I'm also not screen shared. So, but now I am.
Great.
Yeah, I agree with Yosef that this isn't really a question. I agree with Julie that we don't really differ in our views about that. It's also the topic that I feel the least invested of the three that have been posed. So therefore, I'm tempted to try to answer some of Julie's challenges and turn one or two back on her. I'll be good in just a moment. But one question I might like to ask Julie with all that is, to me, it's sort of striking typological results that active case patterns are more common in dependent case in head marking languages, whereas true ergative patterns are more common in dependent marking languages. I think that makes a lot of sense from the point of view of dependent case theory. I wonder what sense asymmetries like that make if you can just learn anything equally well as long as it's systematic in the data. Maybe that's something we can come back to in case they don't call me on me in the discussion period. Now, trying to be a good boy here, I take up the actual topic. Morphological and syntactic case. Like Julie, to me, it seems very clear that the distinction exists and that it's significant. Abstract case features are assigned in the syntax, meaning in ways that are sensitive to C command and phase boundaries and conditions on agree, like intervention. But then they're realized by specific vocabulary items in the morphology in ways that can have their own kind of distinctively morphological complexities. There can be like syncretism between the nominant, the ergative and the absolutive in some parts of an Australian paradigm, for example. That calls for a non-trivial DM style derivation that could use underspecification and impoverishment and techniques like that. So there's both, and I even think there's a kind of modularity here. So we know lots of languages agreement is sensitive to the case of the subject, like whether it's nominative or dative. But it's almost never relevant to the specific morphemes that realize that subject. For example, in an Indo-European language in the declension class of the noun. And I think the same bifurcation between sort of the syntactic assignment of some feature values and the morphological things that can go into how those get realized into morphemes are what we see in other domains such as agreement, as well as the case then. This is something that Julie talked about too, as well as I do. There is a certain tradition among dependent case from people like Morantz and Bobolik that all cases only in NPF. And I would disagree with that. Even what Morantz and Bobolik say is that cases assigned early in PF when still syntactic structure is still available. So you can see things like C command. And they agree that it's assigned in before the realizational system really kicks in. So there's, well, if so they have early PF versus late PF, and early PF has syntactic structure to it. So early PF sounds like syntax to me, and late PF sounds like PF to me. Although I admit that could be sort of a terminological distinction. And I think it's certainly true that these views also don't face all the complexities about the relationship between case and agree or case and movement, like the one that Julie was talking about and that Omer has talked about too, where sometimes movement feeds changes in case assignment, like say topicalization in Saha, but sometimes it doesn't, like scrambling in many languages. And you need to put it in the syntax in order to talk about those things, I believe, too. Here's another related question. Again, Julie touched on this in her own way, and I basically agree. You could ask, do all languages have the same case assignment in the syntax? But they only differ in which of those cases are spelled out in the morphological realization, as in some versions of the strong uniformity thesis. Well, Jean-Roger Vergniaud's original idea about this might have had that flavor under certain interpretation. Yosef mentioned before that, languages that don't seem to have accusative still do have accusative case. But from the point of view of a broader typology, I think that clearly breaks down. So, and the case rules themselves are a source of typological variation, not just the way they do. I agree with Julie, if you don't see ergative case in a language directly or indirectly, it doesn't have ergative case. In particular, from broader typology, you wouldn't just say that all languages have accusative case, you'd have to say they all have ergative case too. If I'm right about oblique in Chamorro and partitive in Finnish, they would have to have that too. Now that's starting to strain the belief. And I think there's even a more serious way that it would screw up the theory of case-sensitive agreement. This is another thing that Julie and I might have a little bit of a difference here too, but simple agreement with a nominative or absolutive noun phrase would need a disjunctive rule, because agreeing with a transitive subject would be covertly ergative, whereas agreeing with an intransitive subject would be covertly absolutive. So you need a disjunctive rule to do the agreement in the syntax. But there's nothing marked about that at all. And conversely, if case can easily be covert, then you could have agreement with covert categories. For example, languages where you have agreement with intransitive subjects, but not with transitive subjects, because the transitive subjects are covertly ergative. That should be easier than the kind of agreement we have, but this is rare or under-attested, maybe unattested. Although I wouldn't be surprised if Julie has one example up her sleeve. So that's what I have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So thank you. Now we are finished with the flash talks, and I'm not really able to give a summary of everything that I heard about now, but maybe for what I found pretty a good, a methodological strategy is what came up here and there was questions of learnability. How should a child find out in which language he or she is? If there are there's no case at all, how would you derive a language which has ergative? I mean, for instance, it needs to have some trigger. I mean, there are simple examples which I cannot mention here, but it seems to me that this is it would be a good point, to reconsider these issues. How to analyze, I mean, languages with dubious case or things that are not so clear from a learnability point of view. Anyway, I don't want to steal time because we don't have much time, but I have seen that we have at least 2 questions. And there is one question by Rita Mancini and the second question by Omer Preminger. So Rita, can you start? Hello, Rita.
Hello, you should be able to see me and hear me now.
We see and hear you.
Okay, so I have very many questions, but I guess I will try to ask a manageable one.
Ask.
I think my prime target is Mark, who holds views about universal grammar more compatible with mine. A side remark is I didn't quite manage to get from Julie what the boundaries of variation are. But here is the question for Mark. It's about the argument from ergative case to dependent case, where you argue that current theories of ergative assignment would lead us to expect an active system, not an ergative system proper. Now, one thing I don't understand, take it as a clarification question, right? Now, if you take the view, I will put the question in a non-sophisticated way. If you take the classical view that ergative alignments have points of similarity with unaccusative alignments, right? I can't see the necessity for ergative case to be assigned inherently. It could just be a structural case, right? Or a PP that kicks in independently of inherent assignment, just exactly like the biphrase. And you could even entertain the idea that active alignments are those where ergative is inherent, and ergative alignments proper are more like, well, let me use this parallelism, even if it is misleading, like passive, right? So I wonder about that. And of course, I would very much like to hear what Julie has to say as well, because she did work on these questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about that. What I would take from Rita's question is that maybe the way that we were phrasing the debates about ergative was a little bit artificially narrow. So we were asked dependent case or case assigned by agreement. And what I take Rita to be bringing up is maybe there are other possibilities too, preposition insertion, whatever happens with biphrase and passive.
You know, Mark, sorry if I can interrupt you. I'm sure you saw Masha Polinsky's book.
Sure.
So she says something different from what I just said. But there again is a take, which is not quite so stark as ergative is oblique, therefore it must be inherent, right?
Yep. But what I'll just repeat about that is, I think Julie's right that all kinds of things are, well, I wouldn't say all kinds of things, but a fairly wide variety of things can influence whether the subject is ergative or not. But in the languages that I've worked on anyway, I'll be darned if the dominant primary thing is whether there's another noun phrase in the clause or not. I think that one does need to be foregrounded. That doesn't, you can foreground that without saying that that's absolutely the only factor. But that's a far better predictor of ergativity in, say, Shipibo than theta role or aspect or definiteness of the object or things that, for Shipibo, what works is number of noun phrases with, 4 exceptions of over application of ergative and 5 exceptions of under application of ergative. Specific predicates that I have are written about at some length. Julie, did you want a piece of that action?
Julie, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I have been perhaps even less convinced of ergative as prepositional phrases. However, again, there are many possibilities as to how ergative cases can be and are realized cross-linguistically. So yes, indeed, there are more options than we considered.
Okay.
I also agree that literally inserting a preposition phrase gets a bit awkward, I think. But good. Sorry.
I was offering that as a point of reference, just to introduce, but my point is whether they are prepositional phrases or they are whatever you want to call them, KPs or DPs with an attached, hosted by applicative projections or whatever you want to call them, they are the sort of things that genitives are in noun phrases, right? But we don't call them inherent just because they are oblique, right?
Okay, we have other questions. On my list was Omer, but I don't know whether someone else wants to ask the question first. Omer Preminger?
Yeah, thanks. So actually, I think Rita might be pleased because I think I'm going to ask one of the things she mentioned but didn't foreground in her comments, and that is a question to Julie about the limits of variation. So as I take it, the program that tries to say there's a very impoverished UG and cases learned from the input is sort of on the hook to show that any pattern that can be learned as a linguistic pattern is also attested as a case pattern, because by definition, there are no other constraints put on it by UG because the content of UG doesn't even mention case. And so there's 2 kinds of challenges that immediately spring to mind. One is that whatever we think about phase theory, and I'm not a big fan, empirically, it's undeniable that there are long distance form dependencies. So I'll mention my favorite in Georgian, Kartvelian language. Negative indefinites take different forms depending on whether they're in the scope of a normal negation, an imperative negator, or a modal negator, meaning impossible. So araperi will change into nuraperi if it's under the imperative, and veraperi if it's under the vera modal. And this can occur across finite clause boundaries, whatever you want. Now, whatever we want to say about this as theorizers, Georgian kids can learn that it does happen in their language, and English children can learn that the corresponding thing doesn't happen in their language. So why are there no case dependencies between a head in a high clause and a DP of a certain kind, or any DP in across two finite clause boundaries, or one for that matter? A second question from the second data point from the other direction of this same question is, look, you mentioned that the basis for case can be syntactic or semantic, given that both the structure and the meaning are available to the speaker. Then it seems to be a rather important lacuna that, to the best of my knowledge, and I've run this by Mark and Jonathan, there is no language that has a case marking that is perfectly coextensive with agentivity, even though agentivity is maybe the most salient thematic relation available to us in language. So yeah, I hand it over to you.
Thank
All
you.
right, so the first question then was about long distance relationships. So I think the child is going to be learning the basic case patterns of their language based on their initial data that they're receiving when they're quite young. So they're going to get basic subject-object kind of cases with their first matrix finite clauses. There are case alternations that can happen across at least non-finite clause boundaries. Even so, Milena is here. So she's shown for Lithuanian that genitive of negation can go all the way into the object of a non-finite clause. So those things can happen. No, we don't see them across finite clause boundaries. I think that's because the child has already made the generalization based on the matrix clauses. Your second question is, why is there no language with perfect semantic agreement? Well, so I think what happens is we tend to have subjects in a language that are other than agents. And so the child is led to make generalizations that aren't specific to semantic relationships. So the child has access to the syntax, it has access to the semantics as well. And so if those relationships are not perfectly semantic in nature, then that's what we expect. The child's going to generalize based on the syntactic structure. I also want to be a little bit careful about the idea of, again, I said I'm worried about this concept of inherent case that's treated as if it's a uniform thing, but I'm concerned that a lot of the discussion in the case literature on inherent case has a really unrealistic expectation for it. So no, it's not the case that all ergative or all agents get ergative, nor is it the case in Icelandic that all experiencers get dative, nor is it the case that all datives are experiencers. There's a relationship, you get exceptions, you get, languages are messy. There's one other thing that you mentioned that I want to say, which is that I do not expect everything learnable to be attested. Language history, the relationships between different language families, cultures, who has guns, these things it's just not realistic to expect every possible language to be attested.
Thank you very much. Okay. I'm afraid that we have to be brief with more questions now. I still have on my list Virginia. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. My question is about languages like Chinese and I gather other East Asian languages. I may have misunderstood some of the claims that you both were making earlier, but my understanding about those languages is that they don't have any external morphology that suggests case, but they do have syntactic phenomena that can only be explained if you assume that there is case. So I'm a little confused by when you're saying, okay, if you don't see any evidence of it, I'm not sure just what kind of evidence you're talking about. You get my question, both of you?
Sure. And I'm not sure either. I will say in this work that I did, the idea of my 2015 book was I was interested in morphological case as opposed to abstract case. I was interested in those affixes and why they were where they were. Not so much interested in what's going on in languages that don't have case. And I think what Julie said before, she can speak for herself, but I would sort of agree with that. I think it's an interesting question. Case endings are definitely relevant to whether the language has a case system or not, and whether that's learnable. Agreement patterns might be or might not be. I have mixed feelings about that. Some typological results work better one way or another. Then we could get into other things like maybe extraction patterns that Julie mentioned. Are those relevant to whether the language has a case or not? Can a child in learnability theory connect a WH movement pattern directly to a covert case category, or would that always be really sensitive to other things, maybe the same kind of underlying syntactic factors that in another language cause case but not case directly? To me, some of those are interesting learnability questions that I have no expertise on.
Okay, thank you.
I agree with everything that Mark just said. I would just want to add that I think the kind of information from Mandarin and other related languages that you're talking about, Virginia, really are about the distribution of noun phrases and control and those types of things, which need not be analyzed using case. And in fact, we tried really hard, but case didn't end up being a good analysis of the distribution of pro, for example. So, yeah.
Thank you both.
I think I should hand over to others who have questions. There was Waltraud Paul. Is she still here? Waltraud, are you still around? Or maybe she has left. But then the next want to ask a question, and I think this should be the last one now. In the interest of time, that would be Andrea Moro. Andrea, are you around?
Yes, I'm still here.
Ah, yes, okay.
It's just an offside and very minor issue, but based on your very interesting hint concerning what is a trigger for children. And I was wondering if we consider the very limited case of an accusative constructions, if and what Mark and Julia think about Helen-Kaiser proposal of considering them as derived from small clauses, of course, to the extent that the element like there or she in other languages are considered as raised predicates, because that would be completely derivative on the problem of case assignment in copular constructions between the subject and the noun phrase, which acts as a predicate. I don't know if that's too confused, but thank you for letting me ask.
Yeah, what do I have to say about that? Again, the answer isn't too much. I sort of like the idea that unaccusative predications always have a kind of a small clause structure where the theme argument is in the spec of VP and there's something often covert as a sort of a resultative predicate inside that. That has to do with my category theory and what I think's at the heart of the verb noun distinction. Never used that in my case theory. I hope it all adds up to a beautiful, uniform, consistent system, but I don't know if it does. I don't know of anything about that works either better or worse in the kind of case theories that I'm familiar with if we adopt that view or not.
Thank you. I mean, Cecilia, do we still have time?
Well, if somebody has one last question, we can take it, and then I think we should close.
Director, there was one question by Adam on coordination. Is he still down?
I saw that one on chat, and I was hoping nobody would ask that one.
I'm sorry. You should have told me before.
Maybe I misread it.
I could have oppressed it, but now, I mean, maybe
that's out of the bag.
I didn't see this. Is it going to be asked?
But there is no question so far. So, I mean, we can also ignore it.
I can read it. I think it's interesting. What about coordination of noun phrases? Wouldn't dependent case predict that the conjunction should have different cases, given that the first conjunct C commands the second and the most popular approach to coordination? Conversely, can agree handle unlike cases into conjuncts, since DOM languages are marked there? Yeah, well, I guess I read it. I mean, that's a cool question. I guess there's really two questions there. So the first part, from my perspective, I don't know if you can see that in the chat, Julie. The question of whether you've got C command within the conjunction phrase, and that would push all conjunction phrases to be different. Have different cases in them. It's an interesting thing that I never really thought about, but my quick answer would be, there's another thing you need to say about that, which is it needs to be a kind of a domain. So for me, you get like a dependent case if X C commands Y within a spell out domain. And if we say, for reasons that I wouldn't understand, that conjunction phrases are never a specialized kind of domain, maybe they're just always inheriting their category feature from their conjuncts, then maybe they would never trigger distinctive dependent cases for that reason. It's true the C command condition is satisfied, but the fact that it happens within a spell out domain would not be. Then there's the issue about DOM languages. That's a very interesting squib that you referred to. To me, that's another kind of evidence in favor. Maybe Julie mentioned this, actually. She probably did. But in favor of the morphology versus syntax distinction, where the two conjuncts probably agree in the syntax, but they could get different spell outs, like if one of them's a pronoun and the other is a noun phrase, and the vocabulary items that realize case are sensitive to that distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Right. This was on coordination. So I didn't see the chat, but yeah, I had used coordination as a test looking at split ergativity, and then I think Laura Kalin and Philip Weiser recently used it for DOM to tell if the two DPs are getting different cases in the syntax or if it's just morphological. So I think it's a useful test. Yeah.
I'll say one other thing about that, just hoping we get more work on that. So they say that most languages that they look at do tolerate different cases on the differential object marked language. But they mentioned two that don't, Turkish and Hindi. And as I've poked around talking to other people, I'm finding more people that don't allow that, even in the languages that they say do. So I think it's a really interesting empirical question that does bear on some of these theories, where we just need more data. We just need to know what the robust generalizations in that area are.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much. I think at this point we have to close this, the meeting, because people are running away to have supper or whatever. So thank you very much, everybody, for being around and special thanks for Julie and Mark for their great presentations. I think everyone has understood a lot about recent developments in case theory. And so thank you very much. Maybe, I don't know, Cecilia, do you want to announce another meeting right now, or?
Yes, so you can see the group of people who have been organizing, which I warmly thank, because I wouldn't do it. I'm not doing this alone. There are a lot of people who are organizing this. Our next flash mob is on the 18th of February, so mark it on your agenda, always at the same time. And we will announce it and send it around through the usual channels as usual. And once again, if you have students or colleagues who are interested in following this, just send us an email message with their emails. We will put them onto the list for the Zoom link. So stay safe, everybody, and good night, and thank you all.